Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the latest technical training from Digitech Systems here. My name is Patrick Cassio. I'm the manager of technical support. Joining us today, we have Kyle Marks, who's our technical support subject matter expert. Also, John Shipman, he's the supervisor of technical support. They'll be handling your questions. Giving the presentation today will be Wendy Hamilton. She's our technical support engineer. She's been working hard day and night getting this presentation together for us. So we really hope you enjoy what we've put together. Please feel free at any time to put your questions in the chat box. We'll be answering those as we go through the training. And any questions that we don't get to as we're going through the training, we will get to at the end. As a reminder, you can always send your questions to support at digitechsystems.com, where we can have support engineers answer your questions at that time as well. So I'm going to give it just another minute here before we get started to let some attendees join. Just going through the list there, I see a lot of familiar names, so everyone I recognize, good to have you with us. And so to the folks I don't recognize or maybe new here, thanks for joining us, and we hope you find the training very useful. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Wendy, who will take us through our technical training top troubleshooting tips. So take it away, Wendy.
All right, thanks, Pat. Thanks everyone for joining today. Like Pat said, my name is Wendy Hamilton. A lot of you have probably already talked to me in the past. Today I will be going through this top troubleshooting tips training. And to start off, I'm going to go ahead and show my screen. Hopefully you all can see it. And we're going to start by going through kind of the agenda so you guys know what to expect for the presentation today. Here is just an overview. We're going to start off by just going over some general troubleshooting tools that are available that can really be helpful out in different environments, such as the login utility. We're going to show how to get that set up and how to use that, as well as some online resources. Some of those might be things that you already know about, and some might be new to you. So after we go through that, we're going to head into Papervision Enterprise. And the top things we're going to focus on here is some common website creation errors that we get calls on pretty often. Also kind of switch gears and talk more about the Papervision / image silo viewer and some common issues that can arise with that, as well as data import issues. And that's going to revolve mostly around monitored import paths and directory manager jobs. After that, we are going to get into Papervision capture. And of course, the top most frequently asked questions are about batch processing, batches stuck in transmission, automated processing, those types of things. We're going to start off by talking about that and demonstrating a few situations. Then we're going to move on to error handling options, mainly for automated steps in your captured jobs. Then after that, we are going to finish up with talking about the maintenance log cleanup option within capture. So that is kind of what is ahead and how we're going to go through the technical training today. As Pat already said, feel free to ask questions as we go instead of having to wait to the very end. We have Kyle Marks and John Shipman who are going to be keeping an eye on the chat and trying to get to your questions as soon as you throw them in the chat box. And then at the very end, we're going to leave the webinar open for a bit, let any last minute questions kind of flow through, and then see where we are then. All right, starting off, like we said, is that login utility and some online resources. Those of you who may not have known, the Papervision login utility is a utility that's automatically installed when the application is installed. That little icon in the top right kind of shows what it looks like if you're searching it through your Windows programs. It's just called the Papervision login utility. And it can be set up on multiple machines to add logging so that you can kind of see any type of errors for different configuration files, and also just some, verbose logging, some informational logs, just depending on what you're troubleshooting at the time. We are going to go through and set it up so we can kind of see all the different options and what it would most likely be used for. One thing to remember as we go through and set this up is that this can be set up on multiple machines. And if you are going to be setting it up on, let's say, different automation servers, you definitely want to know which one, which server you want logs for, and that's, of course, the machine that you need to set it up on. Here, we're just going to kind of go through and I'm going to explain some of the options here, give a little bit of a definition. If you want more information on the login utility specifically, there is a whole section in the administration and architecture guide for PaperVision Enterprise that goes into everything I'm talking about today, as well as probably a little bit more detail for all the options here. But at the very top, you'll notice you can pick a configuration file. So that would be your first step, just depending on what you want logs for. Underneath that is the trace level. We have a few options here. We have error. If that is chosen, it just specifies that recoverable errors are logged specifically. Warning would just be grabbing the non-critical problems and logging those. Information, of course, specifies that informational messages are logged. Verbose, which will you'll probably hear us ask for once in a while, probably the most common that is best for troubleshooting, specifies that debugging trace information is logged. And then you obviously have the option to select all. If you just want all the information available to kind of pick through, you would select that for the trace level. Next, we're going to talk about the configuring the listeners here. You have a few options here as well. For the Windows event log, that just means that you would want the log output to appear in the Windows event viewer on that machine. Selecting email allows the system to email you the log output if you specify your email address there. When you select file, it specifies that you want the log output to go into a file so that you can easily locate the log file and have that to, if you need to send it to someone, that makes it a lot easier there. However, just know when using the file option, all the logs just go into one file instead of separate files, so that file can get fairly large depending on the time frame. And that leads me into the rolling file option. Now, this is the same output as the file option. However, it has a timing structure where after each hour, a new file is created in the same location so that one doesn't get too large. And that's the one that we're going to kind of test out today. All right. One more thing I wanted to point out before we test out the logging utility is when it comes to PaperVision capture. Release 91, we actually added logging configuration to the admin and operator consoles. So it's kind of built in now for that option. This is definitely something we wanted to point out because it can be a little confusing at first if you weren't aware before. If you did try to select a PaperVision capture configuration file, if you had release 91 or higher installed, you would get this invalid config logging section error. That in itself is kind of confusing. You wouldn't necessarily know why it's not working. And that is just because logging is now handled through the admin console or the operator console. When it comes to the admin console in Capture, it's in System Settings under Global Administration, and it's just on the Logging Configuration tab. You can see that screenshot, very similar to the logging utility that we're going to be using here in a second. However, it's just laid out a little different, very user-friendly. You can have the application drop-down instead of selecting specific configuration files. And then this is also an option for the operator console. You would find that by pulling up options on the operator console and finding logging information there. All right, so let's go ahead and set up logging on our test environment. So here I just have a Windows 10 environment that we're going to kind of play with today. I'm going to pull up the logging utility. And first, I'm just going to click my Windows button so you can kind of see what it looks like if you're not using the type here to search option in your Digitech Systems folder. I have quite a few things installed, so I'm having to scroll down a bit, but it is the second to last here, PaperVision Logging Utility. I'm just going to go ahead and select it to open and give it a second. and this will pull up that logging utility. If you don't already have logging configured for a specific configuration file, it'll just come up blank like this and allow you to select which configuration file you want to add logging to. This utility is essentially updating the configuration files for you so that you don't have to edit that XML yourself. We're going to click that little ellipsis to the right and it'll pull up a file explorer for us to find the file we would like. And this just depends on what you want logging for. So the location will depend on what you're going for. I'm just going to throw out a couple options and examples. If you wanted to add logging to the PaperVision or image silo viewer, you would go to the Digitech Systems folder within Program Files, x86, PaperVision, and then you'll notice there is a client folder. Within that has the configuration files you'd want to edit for the PaperVision viewer. For us, we are going to go into the common folder, which you'll see has quite a few options that would be most likely what you would want. Here you'll have the process initiator, which is a service that processes operations for PaperVision Enterprise, as well as the proc worker. The full text processor and those types of things are in this location. We're actually going to use the proc worker for this example. So all you do once you find it, you just double click, select it, and then you can fill out the rest as you would like it. So for trace level, we already went through that. Again, if you need a refresher on that, that information is in the admin and architecture guide. Feel free to look it up anytime. We are going to go ahead and choose verbose for the trace level. And I just want a file that I can look at and pull up and maybe send to someone if I needed to. So I'm going to select rolling file. Once you select your listener, you'll notice the icon to the right of it is the configuration icon, and it is now not grayed out. So I'm going to click that to add my configuration. And here you can specify the location where you want the folder to be and the naming scheme. Underneath that, you can change the timestamp format that it uses to roll a new file every hour if you would like. Here, we're just going to leave it as is. If this was the first time you were setting up the login utility, you would most likely not see this portion. That's something that I added myself. So let's just delete that out. This is what you would most likely see. And if you clicked OK here and then had trouble finding that log, not really sure where to look, if nothing is specified before the name here, it automatically goes to wherever the location of that configuration file is. So that's where you would want to look. Of course, most of the time people want to be able to control where that file ends up, which is what we're doing here. I just have a logging folder on my local C, so it's easy to find. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now that we have everything set, you can click OK on the main utility screen, and you should get a login configuration successfully updated message. I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And you'll notice that the login utility itself did not automatically close. But now that you have that success message, it is saved. You can click OK again. You won't see the success message again, however, and then you can just close out of the utility altogether. Otherwise, you could always pull up a separate configuration file and edit that while you have it open and do that as it goes. So we're going to go ahead and close it out. And my PaperVision automation servers or automation services are running in the background right now. Hopefully I've given it enough time. We're going to go ahead and open the admin console to make sure so that I have something to show you in the logs when we pull them up. So let's go ahead and log in as a global admin. And just want to thank everyone for their patience beforehand for the whole presentation. Of course, our environments tend to be a little shy when a lot of people are watching them and can take a little bit longer. All right, here in my automation service, you'll notice I have multiple operations running every minute. So we're going to go find that configuration file, and we should have enough data by now to see what type of information could be in those verbose logs. So here on my local C, I have a logging folder. Within that, I have a PVE folder and some logs. Now you'll notice that I do have logs from yesterday. I kind of wanted to leave these in here to show you an example of it rolling over. I created logs, and if you'll notice here, about once every hour or so, when there were information to put into logs, it went ahead and created a new file because I was using the rolling file option. If I wasn't, this would all just be one file. Information from yesterday, information today would just be one file. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the one for today. I can just see the date modified 7/22. So I am going to open that as soon as my machine lets me here. And one thing I'll mention while we're waiting, whenever you do set up uh, logging using the login utility, just know that those logs will continue to build up. They will continue to write to that location until you go in and disable it. Definitely something that kind of is not always on everyone's radar. Sometimes you can kind of set it up, grab your file, look at it, and then just be done. However, if you don't want that building up, kind of taking up space, you definitely want to pull up the logging utility and disable it before it becomes a problem and fills up your machine. So here's just an example of this log. You'll notice it's starting and stopping every minute. It's running my operations. I have a return message of success. So if my operations weren't running smoothly, if they were coming up on errors, those would be reflected in this log as well. I'm going to go ahead and close out. And just to do my due diligence, if my machine lets me here, I'm going to go ahead and pull back up that logging utility and kind of show you what you would do in order to stop the logging. It's pretty much everything we just did, just in reverse. All right, so here you would pull up the configuration file you have edited. And we did that proc worker. And I would just gonna uncheck rolling file and select OK. That saved the changes. Now that is no longer saving any of that information in those logs where I had it set in the logging folder, and I would be good to go. Definitely something important to remember when you're setting up those logs. All right. Again, if you have any questions about that login utility, I know it could be kind of a new feature for some of you, not really messing with it so far. Feel free to ask those questions anytime in the chat, and we will get to those. We're just going to move on to some additional troubleshooting tools. We do have how-to videos that can be super helpful if you're a visual type of person and you kind of want to see a step-by-step example of doing certain operations within our products. That can be found on mydsi.digitechsystems.com. If you go up in the top menu, there is a technical support option. Click that, go down to technical training, and you'll see that you can select how-to videos and search by product. We are constantly adding new how-to videos to our library, and we would absolutely love if anyone has a good idea or a suggestion to have a how-to video made. Feel free to send those suggestions into us to support@digitechsystems.com anytime. We would definitely like to hear from all of our end users and resellers of what would be most helpful. After that, we have knowledge base articles. This can be found kb.digitechsystems.com. This has a lot of good troubleshooting information, some common errors that you come across. It kind of gives you a description of what's going on with the error, why it's happening, and how to fix it. So definitely a good resource when troubleshooting. Also, just the product guides. They are packed full of information. Definitely can be kind of hard to sift through sometimes, but we definitely suggest using a search and find feature when pulling up those product guides and getting information from those. Also, of course, this is the support team. We are always here. If you have any questions, feel free to email in or call us anytime with those, and we will do our best to answer. All right, now that we covered that, we're going to dive right into PaperVision Enterprise and start with some common website errors. And before we get into some specific error numbers and how to fix them, just wanted to do a little refresh on the key components to a successful PaperVision Enterprise website. First and foremost, making sure that all the Iis components are installed and the machine has been rebooted since is probably some of the biggest advice I could give. One tiny little Iis component that is missed can cause a lot of chaos for a PaperVision Enterprise website, and sometimes it shows up a little bit later and not right when you install it, so it can kind of creep up on you. Next is using a valid Iis user. The user running the application pulls for the website needs to have the proper permissions to things like the Digitech Systems program files folder, any directories where data is stored, such as your data group path or your full text path. So anything like that, that Iis user needs to have access to and be able to contact. So using a domain admin or anything like that that already has those administrative rights is always suggested. And last but not least, just using an open port. Make sure you don't already have a website that's using the main port. I know a lot of people use, of course, port 80 for their PaperVision Enterprise website. And you might notice right after you get your Iis components installed, there is a default site automatically installed with it. And that just usually needs to be deleted before the PaperVision Enterprise website is installed so that that port is free. All right, the first error we're going to cover is the remote server return an error 500 internal server error. So some of you might have come across this before. This one usually revolves around Iis components and either some of them not being installed or not being installed properly. So we are going to actually jump back to our environment and test this out a bit and talk a little bit more about how we can make sure this doesn't happen. So I have this Windows 10 environment, just trying to install the website here. I have everything already filled out. I have just my local administrator as the Iis user account. That is just for this demonstration. I'm using a standalone system. Of course, if you are using a domain admin, you would want to make sure the username here is set for domain / username and that the password is correct. So just for information, I'm just going to leave it as is since I'm just needing that on my local machine. And I'm going to go ahead and click next and we're going to see what happens here. Anyone that has installed the PaperVision Enterprise website probably already knows that, you have to give it a little bit of time to create the website here. So while it's spinning and thinking about creating it, I'm just going to go over the most likely scenario of what the issue is. So like I said before, Iis components usually bring up that 500 internal server error whenever the website is trying to be created. So if that was the case, then I would want to pull up the uh, turn Windows features on or off. If I had already thought I installed all the Iis components and just wanted to check. If that's the case, you're definitely going to want to pull up the guide. As many of you know, in the installation guide, there is a whole section on configuring Iis. I'm going to pull that up here. And I definitely suggest to kind of have them side by side, kind of go through and check off each one as you go, make sure you have everything installed properly. So here, this is an Appendix E of the installation guide for PaperVision Enterprise. Make sure you have the one for the version that you're installing because they will differ depending on the version. And here at the top, you'll notice that we can select the OS that we are installing on. Like I said before, this is Windows 10, so I'm going to select that option and it automatically drops you down to where that starts on the page. So that's pretty handy. So here, I would just go through, look at all these Iis components and make sure I have them all to the left. So on the left here, I have my .NET framework selected, but if I expand a little bit here, I do see that ASP.NET 4.8 is not selected, and that needs to be, as well as under WCF services, HTTP activation needs to be checked. as well as TCP port sharing. So already right off the bat, I can see that, I don't have a few of the Iis components that I need in order to create the website. So that's why the wizard hasn't given me that success message, and that's what would end up causing the 500 error. And what we would suggest in that case is to go ahead and get all the Iis components installed that need to be installed for it to run properly. And then, of course, rebooting your machine and trying to create the website after that. All right. I feel like I've given this wizard quite a bit of time, but it looks like it's still trying to populate here. So we are going to go ahead and move on and come back to this here in a little bit, see if that error pops up for us, just so everyone can see a visual and kind of put two and two together. So what's going on in the background. So. All right, the next error we're going to talk about is the error 500.19 internal server error. So this is kind of after the fact, after you've already installed the website. It could all go completely fine and successfully. However, if this comes up a little bit later when you're just trying to browse out to the site, this uh, this error is actually pretty handy. If you'll notice under the detailed error information in the config error section, it says cannot read configuration file due to insufficient permissions. Thankfully, some of these errors are very specific and lead you to the issue right away. And some of the other ones kind of have you jumping around a little bit, trying to figure out what's going on in the backside. So here we know for a fact that it's a permissions problem to that location, which is the uh, program files, x86, Digitech Systems, Papervision, and then the pvweb.mbc folder. Within that is where that web.config file is located, and the user it's referring to is that Iis user. So that's the only thing that we kind of have to figure out what user it's talking about. But once you figure that out, you can check your security, check your permissions, and make sure that all that is instated. We're going to go ahead and try go at recreating the scenario and making sure adding permissions does fix the issue. So I am going to return. It looks like this one's still thinking, so we're going to go to another environment here. And as you can see, the website does pull up properly at the moment. I'm going to go ahead and close out and pull up Iis here. Under application pools for Iis within Iis Manager, you'll notice that these three application pools are helping to run the Papervision Enterprise website. We are going to change the identity here. In order to change the Iis user for these application pools, you would right click it, go to Advanced Settings. Under Process Model, you'll notice there is an identity section with an ellipsis to the right once you click into it. And I currently have a user account that I'm changing it to, just called Iis. Same goes for here. If you're using a domain account, you would want the domain to come first. And we're just going to change the user. We're going to do a quick Iis reset, make sure those changes have come into play, and then we're going to try to browse out to the website and see what we get. And while this is loading, I'm just going to pull up a file explorer in case we do have to review permissions and see if that Iis user has permissions to that web.config file. So I'll pull that up while this is loading. And if you needed, you could always have the error up right next to your file explorer to make sure that you knew the exact path that web.config file is located. Finally, thankfully, my website did pull up that error that we saw in the screenshot. So here's kind of another example of it. We're going to browse out to that config file. And then just to kind of get straight to it, I'm going to go to Properties and Security and see what users have access. So it looks like there are a few users listed here as well as administrators. However, this Iis user is not an administrator on this machine. So that kind of makes me think, well, we just need to add it here to have access. So we're going to go ahead and add it real quick. And then we can go ahead and do one more quick Iis reset. And we're going to see if that fixed the issue. All right. Again, thanks everyone for their patience as my virtual environment loads. I'm going to go ahead and click Browse out to the website and let that load. In the meantime, I am going to talk about a very similar error that is just barely different that gets a lot of people tripped up very easily, that we receive calls for pretty consistently. So this is a different slide. It might be a scenario where you're trying to find the differences between the two. But if you'll notice, this 500.19 error has the config error line blank. So if you see this one and it doesn't specifically state it's a permissions issue, this one can be very hard to troubleshoot just because it doesn't give you a lot of information. If you look in the event viewer, when you get this error, there is usually nothing there that's helpful. And what we found is most of the time when this error pops up, it is because the Iis URL rewrite module is not installed or didn't install properly. So what we would suggest in this situation is just to go to your, programs and features on your machine that's hosting the website and make sure the Iis URL rewrite module is installed. If it is installed, maybe doing a quick uninstall and then reinstall would be a good idea as well. And while we're still waiting for that, I can go ahead and pull up what that looks like in your programs and features. So that you would kind of know what to look for. And like I said before, these 500.19 errors are almost 100% identical. So really pay attention to that detailed error information. Try to get as much info from that as you can at first. And if that, of course, doesn't give you a straightforward answer, Event Viewer, we always suggest just double checking there as well. Here you'll see that Iis URL Rewrite Module is listed there. So that's usually the culprit for this one. It's not either not installed and you just have to install it, or it wasn't installed properly and you just need to reinstall it. And that can be found on just doing a search online and downloading it from the website. So. Next, we're going to talk about another very common error. This one is the error 503, the service is unavailable. So this error pops up when you are just trying to get to the landing page of PaperVision Enterprise. So just that login page, that login screen. This obviously doesn't have a ton of information, but it is most likely due to your PaperVision Enterprise application pools stopping and not running properly. So what causes that to happen most likely is that it's a permissions issue, or there is an incorrect username and password entered for the Iis user, and the application pools are stopped, causing it to show service unavailable. So I'm going to try to get this set up while I talk a little bit more about it, since my machine, it's taking a little bit of time to load. What we're going to do here to try to simulate this issue is we are already using the Iis user. I'm going to reset the password in computer management, and then we're going to try to do a quick Iis reset and browse out to it again. And then I'll kind of go into why this happens so frequently and kind of best practices as well. So you might be asking yourself, what would cause um, the app pool to stop if the username and password, was correct when you first installed the website? What would change about that? That would cause you to have to, go in and edit it. Most often, it is due to using a user that is in a security policy where the username and password or the password has to be changed after so many days, for example, 60 or 90 days, and that user goes ahead and updates their password, but it doesn't actually get updated in Iis. That is one very common one that we come across. And then another thing could be that if you're using the same domain admin to run multiple services for different applications, and then one day someone tries to go enter the username and password, maybe the password gets lost, and they decide they need to reset it in order to use it. Without having maybe a sheet of everything that it's being used on, they can definitely forget that it's running the website, not update it here, and everything like that. So those are just a couple reasons why that can happen, and to definitely, check your application pools here whenever you get that error. Um, Hopefully I'll be able to pull up the website here in just a moment, and we can kind of show you exactly what it looks like and what happens to that application pool. All right, so that is kind of loading here in the background. We're going to see if we can get that error to pop up, and then I'll keep Iis open here as well so that we could check that application pool. Looks like we're in luck. I think it is finally loading. Again, thank you everyone for your patience. We've got that HTTP error 503, the service is unavailable. So this one, we would go into Iis and go to our application pools. That's always where I suggest you going first if you're getting the service unavailable, is to see what your application pools are doing. Lo and behold, it looks like the one that's running with that Iis user is stopped. So here it's of course stopped for a reason, but if you wanted to kind of just test to see, maybe something's just kind of a fluke incident, you can go ahead and start your application pool and try to browse out to it again. In this case, if we would do that, it would just do the same thing. It would immediately get this error that's in the background and stop the application pool again. So what we're going to do here is just go to our advanced settings, change it back to that DSU user. And this is an administrator on the machine, so definitely a much better choice. Now we could do an Iis reset, which would automatically start up all the application pools. I am going to try to just go ahead and start this up manually to show you about that. And then we are going to go ahead and pull up the website. I'm going to see if I can just refresh here. I'm probably playing with fire a little bit. I might just have to open up a new browser for it, but we're going to see if this will go ahead and load. Now that it's trying to load, I'm going to check my application pools again to make sure that none of them are already stopped. Looks like they're all still running, but it's still trying to pull up the website. So I'm just going to give it a second. I'm actually going to just pull it up in a new browser, give ourselves the best chance possible here. And then we're going to move on to a couple other issues that we see often get calls about when it comes to the website specifically. All right, I'm going to let that load. And just to recap on that 503 error, service is unavailable, check those application pools. Make sure you're using a domain admin or an administrator account that has access to everything it needs, has the permissions in place. Also, we definitely suggest making it to where the account cannot change the password. That kind of helps negate the password change issues that you would normally come across. The next one that we get a lot of calls about that can be extremely frustrating and sometimes a little hard to troubleshoot is the unable to load file or the failure to find file errors that you get when you're trying to pull up documents in Papervision Enterprise. So for this, you'll notice in the little screenshot in the bottom right, it does have a little error. It says unable to load file, but it doesn't give us much more information than that. Thankfully, in the browser-based version viewer, you usually do see a failure to find file with the full path. I'll show you that here in a minute, as long as I can get to that website and log in. Usually what we suggest checking first is, does that file exist in your data group path? So you would take the path listed when you are trying to view the document, check the folder, make sure a file that is named that exists. If it doesn't exist, then you can start trying to figure out why. See maybe if the file got accidentally deleted. Was there recently a move where, a migration from one machine to another? Maybe some of the files got lost in the shuffle. And then it could also, if the file is there, it could also just be a permissions issue, or it could just be a connection issue in general, where it just can't the user running the website just does not have access to it or cannot reach that server where the data is held. Our top troubleshooting tips when you get either of these errors is ask yourself, is it specific documents or all documents? That'll kind of give you an idea of whether it's maybe a few documents that you need to re-upload or just a few documents that got lost or accidentally deleted. If it's all of your documents, then you can kind of start looking more towards the server. Check those permissions. Is it just not seeing the data groups? Maybe you did a migration and the folder structure changed with your data group path, and that just needs to be updated in your admin console within data storage. So those are the types of things that these questions can really help you narrow down your search. Another great question to ask yourself is it one machine or is it affecting all machines? So if just one user on one machine can't view a file, but everybody else can, then you can definitely focus in on their machine and maybe some temp files. Maybe they just need to reinstall the viewer, something like that, instead of focusing on the server. If all machines are unable to view it, then of course you could focus on the data itself. Another good suggestion we have is, if you can, definitely double check in both the browser-based viewer and the Papervision or image silo viewer, also referred to as the PVWA. This will definitely help. Sometimes one works and the other doesn't, and that can kind of zero you in on the issue. Maybe it's just a reinstall of the viewer that's needed. And it's just definitely something good to check, especially since sometimes one versus the other can give you a more complete error code for you to work with. All right, it looks like that is still loading, so I'm just going to leave that there and we are going to move on here. The next thing we're going to do is really focus in on the Papervision image silo viewer itself, common errors, and the tips that we have for that. The first one is a very, very, thankfully, usually easy one to fix, but surprisingly common on the phones, is that the user double clicks a document and nothing happens. They get the loading screen and then nothing pulls up. They don't see a document. The viewer doesn't pull up, or the browser-based viewer. So what happens there most of the time is that the user has their document viewer set to the Papervision or image silo viewer. However, they don't yet have it installed on their machine. This happens quite often if the entity itself, if the default document display is set to the viewer, every new user created, whether they have the viewer installed or not, anytime they pull up a document, it's going to default to that and try to pull it up. If it's not installed, it'll kind of just sit there and kind of leave you wondering what the problem is. So the first thing to check is check your programs and features, see if that viewer is installed. If it is and it's still not opening properly, a good system reboot is always suggested, or maybe a clean reinstall. Another very common issue, the viewer is freezing up or locking up either when you're viewing documents or trying to edit them. A lot of the time, you can fix these types of issues by just deleting out some temporary files that could get corrupt and kind of affect the flow of the viewer. Here are two of the locations, and I'm actually going to pull that up here on my side so we can kind of see it. And I'm going to put that down here and pull up a file explorer. These are both located in the same directory, and that's going to be your local app data on the machine. In order to get to that, you can just go to your local C. And then here in the users folder, you can then pick the username that you're currently logged in as. That's the most important part. And I am currently logged in as DSU, so I will click that. And app data is the next folder. This is a hidden folder. If you don't see it, make sure hidden items are checked in the view options of your file explorer. Once you're in there, you'll notice a couple folders. Local, the top one, is what you're going to want to go into. Here you'll notice a Digitech Systems folder and an isolated storage folder. If I browse into the Digitech Systems folder, I will have a PaperVision folder, and within that is my document viewer folder. So this is the directory. Back in local, you can just go ahead and either rename or clear out Digitech Systems folder as well as the isolated storage folder, and then reload the viewer and see if that fixes your issue. Probably, I would say like 9 times out of 10, that is enough. Usually clearing out the cache maybe, or clearing out those temp settings to get the viewer back to its working state and working properly. However, if that does not fix the issue and this is the only machine that's having issues, I would definitely suggest just doing a clean reinstall. And the most important part about doing the reinstall is you're going to want to make sure you're running that installer as an administrator. Sometimes that is what caused the issue in the first place, just not having those rights. And that is just something definitely to remember when you have to reinstall. Next, we're going to talk about scanning issues. I'm just going to briefly talk about some tips for this. If your scanner is not showing up as an option in scanner configuration within the viewer, most likely it is the machine itself is just missing the needed drivers. So for PaperVision Enterprise viewer or image silo viewer, Twain drivers are what is needed to be present for it to work properly with the viewer. So all you would do is look up that model of scanner online, find the drivers for it, make sure just the main driver for the scanner itself is installed properly, as well as the Twain driver alongside it. Usually just installing that, give it a quick reboot, usually fixes the option, and then you can see the scanner when you open up configuration. If the scanner is freezing up the viewer when you're using it, especially if it's kind of an intermittent issue, which we see from time to time, sometimes that could be from one, the driver's not being installed, or the most recent driver not being installed. So I would check the drivers just like the first issue, check to make sure it's the most recent that you can get for those drivers. And then sometimes just uninstalling and reinstalling will fix the issue as well. So just a couple of troubleshooting tips that we just discussed. Make sure those drivers are installed, and then ask yourself, is the scanner working with other applications That one can help out quite a bit if you try to pull up something general like Windows Fax and Scan or just another application on your machine and you cannot use the scanner with that either, then you can stop focusing on paper vision and just kind of focus on your environment and the scanner itself. Also, always if the issues are intermittent, sometimes it is just a faulty USB port. Try changing the USB port on your machine to see if it fixes the issue that way. Also, just making sure you're using a scanner that will work with our software. So you're definitely going to want to find a scanner model that has those Twain drivers available in order to work properly with the viewer without giving you a lot of headaches down the road. All right, we're going to move on to data import errors. So like I said, kind of in the overview, this is going to be mostly talking about monitored import paths and directory manager jobs. So here we have monitor import paths is what we're going to be talking about first. And we're going to talk about what to do or what to ask yourself if data groups are just not being imported. So let's say you have a monitor import path set up. You have data groups in the path ready to go and nothing's happening. They're just sitting there. You're searching in PaperVision Enterprise website. You don't see any of the documents and what to check. So first and foremost, the kind of gotcha moment that a lot of the times happens is that monitor import path automation service operation is not running. So make sure you go to your system settings, automation service operation, and add it there, which we'll take a look at here in a second. Another issue why sometimes it doesn't get imported is if antivirus is currently scanning that location. So you're going to want to make sure and have those exclusions set for your antivirus for any monitored import paths. Next is the process initiator to service. User does not have proper permissions to the directory. You'll notice permissions is definitely a common factor with a lot of these issues that are with both of our products. Those permissions are extremely important to have correct. If the process initiator to service user does not have permissions to the directory, of course, when it tries to go out and get those data groups to pull in, it won't be able to. It won't even see them. Another one that you'll get sometimes is just that the initial data group has not been manually mapped to your entity. So if the project does not exist in Enterprise, it's the first time this data group is getting pulled into Enterprise, that first one has to be manually mapped. So you would just go into data storage and import manually, and then any additional data groups will automatically import from then on out. And I'll show you that here in a second as well. And then finally, if submit files are required and they aren't present, of course, the service will look for those. And if they're not there, it's not going to pull them in either. So here we're going to go back to our environment here, and I'm going to pull up the admin console. I'm going to go ahead and pull up a new instance of it here. And on my local C, you'll notice that, here, let me go to my local C. I currently have a folder called MIP, which is my monitor to import path. So that is where I'm wanting the data groups to be pulled from. If I go into here, you'll notice that I have a data group folder that includes an MDB data group ready to be pulled in. So let's log in and see what the situation is here. All right, so I'm going to go to import under global administration and monitor import paths. As you can see, I have a monitor import path already set up for this location. It's my local C, MIP folder. However, if I go into import logs, nothing is being pulled in. So that's sitting out there. It should be pulling in by now. So the first thing I would check, of course, is that operation running? To do that, we would go to System Settings, Configure Automation Service Scheduling, monitored import paths. So it looks like I already added this to my automation service schedule, and it is running every 1 minute. The next thing you would check, of course, is making sure the status is success, making sure the last runtime was recently. Here it looks like it ran last about 30 seconds ago, so that is not the issue here. The next thing I would check is permissions. So to do that, I'm going to pull up services on my machine. I'm going to look at the process initiator to service and see what user is running that service. It looks like it's user MIP on this machine. So the next thing I need to do is make sure that that user has permissions to the directory. So let's take a look and find out. I'm sure most of you can guess that it probably doesn't, since that's what we're kind of going through and showing. And you're right, it does not. Just DSU user and the administrators on the machine, and it is not part of an administrative group. So let's go ahead and add it here and see if that takes care of the issue. All right, we went ahead and added it. We shouldn't need to restart any services. We would just really need to wait for that monitor import path to run one more time. So that is what we will do. And if you were curious on when the next runtime is, you can always go into Configure Automation Service Scheduling, take a look at that next runtime. I do this quite often, especially when I'm feeling a bit impatient. You could see what time it is. It looks like it's going to run again at the last second here. And it looks like it just ran. So I'm just going to give it a second, and then we will check our import logs to see if that fixed the issue. Give it a little longer here. All right. Gave me a little scare, but it looks like it did successfully import here. You can see it just pulled it in and has that success message. So that fixed that issue. And now let's go ahead and set up another monitor import path and see if it works for us. So here I have another folder, data group import folder, that has 3 data groups within it. Each of these data groups need to be imported. They are XML data groups, which should be automatically imported just fine. Let's go ahead and create our new monitor import path, and we'll talk about a few best practices here as well. Because I'm kind of working from this standalone machine, I definitely don't have to worry about any UNC paths. I could really just focus on local stuff, since connectivity won't be an issue for me. However, of course, in any real world scenario in your environment, we definitely suggest not using local paths here. For example, I'm using my local C path. If I click OK, we even have that prompt here, and letting me know that it's probably not good to use this local path. You're going to want to use a UNC path. That is just to make sure if you have your automation services running on different machines, they are going to see that local path look on their machine instead of the server that has the information itself. So, all right. And we will go ahead and check my data group. This is an XML data group, so I just want to make sure it has that data group.submit file. It does, so that shouldn't be an issue either. And we went ahead and added it. Now we already know the monitor import path is running, so all we need to wait for really is that success message in the import logs. And again here, if I wanted, I could go and see when the next time it's going to run, but we'll just keep refreshing here. And definitely normal circumstances, 1 minute seems so short until you try to update your import logs for 60 full seconds. But here finally we see that we have the attempts and they have failed. So each one of these data groups failed to import. Thankfully, it does give me a failed message to go off of. I'm just going to double click this. And it lets me know that this has not yet been mapped to an entity. You must manually map or import the first data group. So we kind of talked about this already. There is no project that it exists in enterprise for these for these data groups yet. So that's something that I have to do manually. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go to data storage within the entity, data groups, and just manually import our data group there. I'm only going to do the first one because then I fully expect the other 2 to automatically come after. And we definitely want to test that out. Make sure this loads. All right, import complete. So now we're just playing that waiting game again. I'm gonna go to the import log and oh, it looks like we got lucky and caught that operation right as it was running. And you'll notice now that we have all three of them successfully imported. The first one was manual and then these two right after when the monitor import path was scanned. So those are just a few circumstances that we see very commonly when it comes to monitored import paths. So just kind of a recap, make sure your operation's running, definitely check see if there's any permissions issues, even check if the server that the data is stored on, make sure you can browse out to that location. Maybe even log in as that service user and then try to browse out to that location to make sure permissions are in place. And of course, the submit files that are required for XML data groups, of course, you want to make sure those submit files are there. MDB data groups do not necessarily require the submit files, but if it's an XML, that is something you'll need to keep in mind. Next, we're going to move on to directory manager jobs, and this will kind of seem a little familiar now. We've already talked about the main issues, and you'll see that they are very similar. That automation service operation, there is a separate one for directory manager jobs specifically. Antivirus gets in the way all the time. Make sure those exclusions are set for your antivirus, especially for all the directory manager locations. We do have a KB article on this if you went to our kb.digitechsystems.com. Very helpful. It's over Paper Vision Enterprise and also one for Capture that kind of talks about the locations that you would want to put exclusions for when it comes to antivirus if you want to check it out. Also, Process Initiator 2 service has to have permissions to the directory, and you just want to check your configuration settings for your directory manager job. Depending on what you choose there, it will definitely affect how your data is imported and whether or not it has errors. It could stop and disable your job, which we'll see here in a minute. Also submit files at the system settings level of PVE. You can require the directory manager submit files. If that is the case, nothing, of course, is going to pull in without one. So as we've been doing, let's go ahead and try to run a directory manager job, see if we can get ourselves into a pickle and figure out how to fix it. So here I'm just going to give you a little overview of what I have already configured. I have a directory manager job under my directory manager project here. Right now it is set to inactive. It's looking at my local C drive directory manager folder. So let me show you all what that looks like so you can get an idea of this data structure. So here I have multiple folders, all with company name as the folder names. And as I drill down to the actual file, you'll notice that I'm going to be using all of these folder names as index fields within Paper Vision Enterprise, which I already have configured, and I'll show you here in a second. And then we just have a TIFF file at the end that I'm hoping will import into the system. If I pull up the job here, I have my field extraction all filled out to grab that information and convert it into index field values. I also have the path listed here. Minimum modified date is definitely an important one to check if you're noticing a lot of duplicates from Directory Manager in Paper Vision Enterprise. If this minimum modified date is set to disabled and you do not require submit files for Directory Manager jobs, the same data can be pulled in over and over and over again if it is not deleted after successful import. So definitely suggest keeping this enabled so it only searches for new documents. Underneath that, in my error handling at the very bottom left, you'll notice that I have it set to stop importing and to disable job if it comes across any errors. So I'm going to leave that as is, and we are going to activate the job. Click OK. My data is out there ready to be picked up. My job is active. We can go to our import logs and give it a second to run to see if it works properly. It still hasn't pulled anything in. I don't have any failures either. So first thing I'm going to check is my system settings. configure automation service scheduling, and lo and behold, I do not have a directory manager job operation listed. So that is what we need to add in order for it to pull in, and definitely a very common issue that we see. Definitely want to make sure that is running and is present. So we're just going to give that a second to run. And then if it still doesn't pull anything in, the next thing, of course, you would check is permissions issues. However, it looks like it did try to pull it in and we have a failure. Whenever you have a failure for directory manager jobs, you can double click it with an import log and it will give you really helpful information. So under the message, you'll notice that this specific document is missing a required index field, which is invoice date for my project. So in my project, I have a couple fields that are required. This specific file is missing that information. So what I need to do is either add it or change my job configuration so it would skip it and import everything else. So what we're going to do is just come in here. And this is the one in question. The error itself gave a path. If you needed to know exactly which one and where it was, we're just going to add a mock date here. And now a lot of the times you would just think to wait and let it run again and see if it worked. But if you'll notice, if we go back to the directory manager job, it is set to inactive. That is because of our settings. If you'll see here in our error handling, it's supposed to disable a job if it gets to any errors. So what we're going to do is go ahead and activate it and click OK and hope that it pulls everything in. Otherwise, just know you can use the skip document and continue, and then email administrators document import errors. This is handy so that you know exactly when it comes across a document that you need to fix. However, everything else still gets imported, so you don't have to wait and fix issues before everything can be imported. So we're going to go ahead and click OK, go to our import logs, and play that waiting game again. We can always go into automation service scheduling, make sure it's still running. It looks like it is, and it's probably going to run any second now. So let's go back to import logs. And currently I just have one automation service instance running all my operations, but just know, of course, you can have multiple instances on a machine if it can handle it, running these operations more often. So here we have our success message. It looks like it worked just fine now that we fixed our issue and imported all 19 documents. So just a little recap there. You definitely want to check all these things if you are noticing your directory manager job information is not being pulled in. Most of the time it comes down to permissions or just the service not being able to reach the server where the data is located. So just make sure that is something that you keep in mind. Also, if you have submit files required, that would need to be present before anything can be pulled in. Here are just some best practices when it comes to data import. Like we've talked about before, use UNC paths across the board. You definitely don't want to deal with local paths if you have multiple machines in the mix. We also suggest using the copy to data group path and delete after successful import options when it comes to pulling in data. If you do not use these options, especially the delete after successful import, the information in your monitored import paths and directory manager job directories just sit there and don't get cleared out. And that can really build up over time and make that location really, really full of data. Each time those operations run, it has to scan everything looking for new items. And that's just going to take longer and longer and longer as you pull in more data groups. So those are just some things that we suggest. And process initiator 2 service user permissions, make sure that they have the permissions they need for all the directories involved, and setting up those antivirus exclusions. Some key little clues there is if you see in your event viewer of your automation server, if you see kind of like some errors mentioning that files are already in use or anything like that, it's usually pointing very strongly at antivirus scanning those locations. All right, so we are going to move on to paper vision capture here and just talk about some common issues with batch processing. Again, if you had a lot of questions still for Paper Vision Enterprise, feel free to keep using the chat box, and we will open it up at the very end and give everybody options there as well. All right, we're going to start with batch processing. And to do that, I just want to go over a very general look at a batch life cycle. Knowing exactly how batches move through definitely helps when you're troubleshooting to know where in the path, where in the cycle it is going wrong. So just to kind of explain this screenshot, if a lot of you haven't really dealt with batches before, this might look like complete gibberish to you. No problem. Hopefully it makes a little bit more sense at the end of the training. But in the top left-hand corner, we have a file explorer that's showing our master batch repository. This is usually located, of course, on the application server or wherever your master batch repository is stored, where all your batch data is stored. To the right of that is my local batch path. These locations are on end user machines who are processing batches through manual steps. Each time they create a batch or take ownership of a batch, a folder is created on their machine in their local batch path to store files as they're working on batches. And then that information gets pushed over to the master batch repository when those batches are submitted complete or incomplete. Underneath that to the left, you'll notice my data transfer agent command files. And if you see anything that says DTA, it does stand for data transfer agent there. This holds command files that tell the data transfer agent service on those end user machines when to move the batches from local batch path to master repository and vice versa. To the right of that, anyone that messes with batches knows that that is the operator console. That is how we're going to create and edit batches. Underneath all of that is our admin console. And the administration console is set in the screenshot to batch management, where you can see all the statuses of your batches, what step they're in, and everything like that. So that's just kind of what we're working with. We are going to create a batch and submit it so that you can see all of this working together, hopefully smoothly, all at the same time. So that's what we're going to get into first. Before we do that, I'm just going to talk about batches stuck in transmission, which is our most common issue when it comes to capture that we get calls about pertaining to batches. So we often just have people calling in saying, I have batches that are just stuck in transmission, which is the status, and how do I get them out? How do I keep this from happening? Why is this happening? So batch info needs to transfer from the local batch path to the master batch repository once the user has submitted it complete or incomplete. If it's stuck in transmission, it just comes down to that not happening properly or successfully. You just need to figure out why. So some common reasons why that doesn't happen properly is the data transfer agent is not running, or the data transfer agent user, the user running the service, does not have proper permissions. So one of those two issues is usually what's the problem. Or the data transfer agent could just be in a faulted state, shows that it's running, but if you try to restart it, you would most likely get an error. Another situation where this can happen very frequently is that if the end user turns off their machine right after they submit a large batch, and it just doesn't have time to fully transfer all the files. So that we see that pretty often too. There are a couple ways to fix batches that are stuck in transmission. And don't worry, we are going to go through this and we're going to do it together, but those are to retransmit the batches from the machine that first submitted them within the operator console, or to fix the issues with the data transfer agent, and then they will automatically transfer the files and everything will be good to go. So we're going to go ahead and pull up our environment here. I'm going to get out of all of our PaperVision enterprise related windows, and I am going to pull up my screen exactly like the screenshot. So if you will just be patient with me real quick, I am going to try to get everything in one screen. I'm hoping that everyone can see everything large enough to see what's going on. I'll try to explain everything as well as I can as we go through, so there's no confusion of what you're really looking at. So top left, I have my master batch repository. This would most likely be on your main application server or whichever server has all of your data stored. Top right is my local batch path. Bottom left is my data transfer agent folder with my command files. And now we just need to pull up our operator console and our admin console. So I'm going to do that now. And again, thanks everyone for your patience. Once we get everything up, we are going to go ahead and create a new batch. We're going to keep an eye on all these windows and kind of see the process that it goes from our local batch path to the master batch repository. We're going to see how those command files work. And then we are going to quote unquote break our data transfer agent service, and that will help us troubleshoot and force us to fix it. So my operator console should open up here in one moment. And then I also need to grab my admin console here. And the admin console, we're not really going to be doing any type of configuration changes there. We're just needing it to look at the batch status. So while we're waiting for the admin console to come up, I'm going to go ahead and create a new batch. Right? I'm just going to use that DSU job that I already have preloaded. Name the batch something specific, and then it should open up the operator console window where we can import an image and submit it. Let me move this around so we can see a little bit better. And you'll notice in the top right-hand corner in my local batch path, that folder has now been created. That was automatically done by the system. It is now going to hold all of the files for this batch that I just created. So let's go ahead and import just a test image. We are not going to worry about these exports or anything, so we really just need something in here to work with, and then I'm going to submit it. Before I submit it, I'm going to go ahead and stop my data transfer agent so that we can get ourselves into a situation and have a good example of what happens and what's supposed to happen versus what sometimes does if the data transfer agent is not working properly. So let's submit the batch complete. And you'll notice the folder is still in our local batch path here. Over here in our data transfer agent command files, you'll notice that the system created a command file with the batch information. You'll notice the internal batch name is listed here, so it knows which folder to be looking for in my local batch path. And then it ends with the extension .ready. So that is telling the data transfer agent, hey, this batch is ready to be moved from local batch path to the master batch repository, and that is what starts that process. So right now, if this was the case, I would go down to my admin console, go to batch management, and then I would look at the status of this batch. At this point, it's going to show as stuck in transmission, which it does. So this is what we're kind of talking about in this situation. When your batch is stuck in transmission, that's just the status it is. We could keep refreshing all day and it's not going to change because we kind of know what the issue is on this machine. So if that is the issue and you see it's in transmission, I always suggest the first thing to do is to come to the operator console, go to File, and click Retransmit Batches. Sometimes for some reason or another, maybe that command file didn't get created properly, and that is why the data transfer agent isn't processing. So we're going to click Retransmit Batches. However, it'll tell us no batches require retransmittal. That is because the command file is there and is set to .ready. Nothing needs to be done with it. So what we would do is check our data transfer agent. And here, if it was already running, then you would check the log on as user, make sure it is a user that has full permissions to all the directories involved, everything we have up on the screen pretty much. And then maybe give it a restart. If you try to restart the service and you get an error that it couldn't start, maybe just a reboot of the computer is all that's necessary, or maybe you just need to reinstall it on this machine. For us, we know that it's just not running. Sometimes that is the case if not all services boot up or start working when you boot up your computer in the morning. You can come in here, right click, hit start, and then it would process your command file just fine. What we're going to do to kind of demonstrate the retransmit batches a bit more is we are going to change the file here from .ready to .failed. So if you had this scenario stuck in transmission, your data transfer agent was running, and then you look in your command files and you notice that it says .failed instead of .ready, that means that the data transfer agent did attempt to move it from one location to another, but it failed for one reason or another. Usually it is due to permissions. So that is the first thing that I would check. Otherwise, sometimes it is just due to the service not running properly, needs a reboot, needs to be reinstalled, anything like that. However, once the command file is set to .failed, if we come over to the operator console and try to retransmit the batches, we would get a message letting us know that that one batch has been retransmitted. The command file is going to change from .failed to .in progress. Well, first it changes to .ready. Data transfer agent would then grab it, move it to in progress and out. So let's go ahead and try that. We're going to click retransmit batches. You'll notice that we have this message letting us know that this batch was retransmitted, and it changed to .ready for us. So that is what retransmitting batches does. It looks for any failed command files, changes the extension so that the data transfer agent tries again. We're going to go ahead and start our data transfer agent service up, assuming that whatever issue it had, we have fixed. You can see that's changed to in progress very quickly. It is transferring the data right now, and then when it's done, that command file will be removed from this location. So we're just going to sit here. My machine's kind of going a little slower anyway, so this gives us a good view of what's going on. What we're looking for is this file to disappear, and this batch here, this folder to move from batches to master batch repository. If it doesn't, if it kind of just sits here, the next thing that we need to do is check the status in batch management. And it looks like it was on automated processing, so it was kind of going a little slower, but still working. And you'll notice that the command file is now missing. It cleared it out because it doesn't need it anymore. And our local batch path folder is gone. And you'll see this is that folder that moved over to the master batch repository. So that is kind of how it works when it comes to batches. I hope that information really helps when it comes to dealing with batches stuck in transmission. Those command files go from .ready to .in progress, and then they are cleared out once it goes from local batch path to the master batch repository. All right. like I said before, those command files can give you a lot of clues. If it's set to .failed, you at least know your data transfer agent tried and couldn't for some reason or another. If it's stuck at .ready, you know it hasn't even tried to run it. Next, we're going to talk about batches stuck in automated processing. We don't see this as often, but it definitely comes up. First thing you would want to check is that the process initiator 1 service is running on your automation server or servers if you have more than one. You would also want to check to make sure there is a maintenance queue item in the maintenance queue in the admin console for that batch. So here in the screenshot, you can see that there is one listed below. You could even double click that and see more information on which batch it's referring to. Batches that are in automated processing, of course, need to have a submit batch in the maintenance queue in order to tell the operation that that needs to be processed. And you want to make sure your maintenance queue operation is running. So oftentimes maintenance queue isn't running properly, or it just hasn't been added and process batch has. That will cause the batches to be able to be created, owned, and worked on. However, when they are trying to go from one step to another, depending on the steps, they would be stuck in automated processing and not be able to move further than that. So that's a pretty common one that has batches that are stuck in automated processing. Just making sure that maintenance queue operation is running properly. You could even check it here in your system settings under global administration. Here you'll notice that I do have my process or my maintenance queue item running every 20 seconds. However, if there was an issue, the status would show an error and might help you kind of figure out what the problem is, whether it's a permissions problem, whether it can't contact a different server, or whether it's just something that needs to be reinstalled. So definitely look there if you have batches that are stuck in in automated processing. All right, now we're going to move on to batches that are looping through automated steps and throwing all sorts of fun errors in your event viewer. So we are going to try to set up a situation where this actually does happen, and it would allow us to fix it so that you can kind of see what causes it as well as what to do to fix it. So a lot of the times when you see batches that are going from not owned to owned, back to not owned for their status in automated steps, it's usually either A, the process initiator 1 service that's trying to complete the operation. The user does not have permissions that it needs for either any of the directories, or maybe if you're dealing with something like a match and merge and it just can't access a SQL database or anything like that, it can just keep looping and looping, trying, but not going anywhere. Next, you just want to double check your step configuration issues for that automated step. For example, if you were using an export step and the path that you had was invalid, maybe you put it in as a local path instead of a UNC path, or the server name in the UNC path was incorrect and it just cannot browse out to that server. Those types of things are very common. It could be a bad image that's stuck, causing it to keep looping. That's more common in things like image processing steps or full text OCR steps, anything like that. Thankfully, usually the event viewer does a very good job about giving you errors that point to specific documents, specific pages, if that is the case. Next, like I said before, if the service or if the job is unable to access data on other servers, if you're using something like a match and merge and your SQL database is offline or anything like that, it'll keep trying to get that information and failing and then keep looping. So batch looping is something that is not always uh, easy to notice or acknowledge. It happens fairly quickly. So we are going to set up that situation so I can give you a little bit more information and then we will fix it. So here I already have a job set up for this very situation. It is only a capture step that leads into a custom code step, which has a match and merge. So I'm trying to pull data from a SQL database using a SQL user. What we're going to do on the back end is to change the login for that user. I already have it configured within the job, but we're just going to change the password here to cause it to error out so we can see how it loops, and then hopefully the event viewer will give us a good idea of how to fix it. So I'm just going to change it to something other than it really is. And we are going to create a batch in that job. Try to make it named something specific so we can see it within batch management. And here we're just going to import a single image and submit it real quick. And we're just going to put in some general data just so it doesn't yell at us, and submit it complete. So next, this batch needs to go through the custom code step, which is the match and merge. So we are just going to keep refreshing here. My operations are running every 20 seconds, better than 60 for sure, but it will take just a moment for it to go through automated processing and then come up to that custom code step. While it's doing that, I am going to go ahead and pull up my event viewer because I know we're definitely going to want to look at it, and it might take a moment to load. When it comes to looking for errors for batches that are stuck in certain steps or looping, you are going to want to go to Windows Logs and then Application. That's probably going to be the best place that you're going to find these types of errors. So we're going to have that open, and I'm going to pull this back up to see if it's moved along. Looks like it's still in automated processing. Now you'll notice that it is not owned. It's this last batch in line if you can't see, and it is in custom code step, which is the match and merge. Right now, just to give you some information on the back end, it's trying to contact that SQL database to get information from it. However, it's not going to be able to because we changed that password. So as we're going, I'm keep refreshing. I'm hoping that I will catch it in an owned status so that you guys can see what I mean by looping. Essentially, it just goes from not owned to owned, back to not owned. I might not get that lucky, but I'm just going to keep refreshing here. It happens very quickly, which points to how hard it can be to troubleshoot these types of issues. For someone just looking up batch management, unless they're sitting here clicking refresh over and over again, more than likely they won't notice that it's looping until they get into the event viewer and they see hundreds and hundreds of errors. So that's just a little bit of background on why this issue is a problem. So we see that we have a batch invalid job is set to owned right now. So this might be the first time it's trying to work on it. I'm going to keep refreshing, and now it's back to not owned, but the step is still custom code. So it tried to work on it. It couldn't, so it put it back to not owned. The next time my operations run, it's going to go back to owned and try again, getting into a vicious cycle. So we're going to refresh our event viewer here, and I fully expect to see some errors, and we do. So most likely these types of errors will be the source of PV proc worker, since that is what's trying to process these operations. And if I just look at the first one, it really gives me all the information I need, even though it's very short and sweet. It tells me the batch that it's working on, what step it's working on, and it even tells me that the login failed for the user PVC. I also have some SQL errors here that come right before it, pointing to the password not matching. So in this event, the event viewer really helped us out. We definitely suggest to look at the event viewer whenever you get batches that aren't going through because it will usually point to the issue very specifically. As you can see, I refresh one more time. I've got another set of errors, and I will keep continuing getting these errors every 20 seconds when those operations run. You can understand how this would really build up in your event viewer, and that is not at all what you want for your batches, especially if it's not something that you notice right away. So that kind of leads us into our next section. I'm going to leave that in the background to probably accumulate another 100 errors. And we're going to talk about batch error handling. This is just some preventative measures to make sure something like this does not happen. This feature was added in release 86 of Capture. It's called the automated step error handling. This is for automated steps, of course, and you can enable it, set the number of attempts you want it to try before it goes into an error hold state. This is very, very useful, especially when you have a lot of automated steps and you don't want to sit there and have to manage your batches every minute of every day. You also have the option to send email notifications to certain email accounts whenever a batch is moved into an error hold state so that you can get the email, know, oh, okay, I've got to go fix that. You can go and adjust some configuration settings or kind of troubleshoot what the problem is and without errors continuing to pile up your event viewer. So the best thing to do here is for us to just kind of demonstrate how to do that. So that's what we're going to do. We already have a nice situation set up. We have a batch that's looping right now, and we want to make it to where it goes into error hold instead. So we're going to pull up that job, and I'm going to show you how to set that up. All right, looks like my job definition is slowly loading here in the background. And what I'm going to do first, once it's fully loaded, I will check the job out so that I can edit it. We're going to add that error handling, check it back in, and then the next time that batch runs through that step, it should automatically change the status to error hold. So I'm going to select my automated step. You can set auto processing error hold on all of your automated steps if you'd like, but it is step specific instead of job specific. So you do have to set it up on each automated step if you want it. We're going to go ahead and check the enabled button. I've already been waiting a while. We already have a ton of errors, so I'm going to put this just to number of attempts 1. However, if you want it at 2 or 3, that just means that it will try it that many times before it eventually moves it into error hold. You can set specific errors for it to ignore, and you can set up your email notification here. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here, check the job back in, and that will save on check-in. And now we're going to go back to batch management, and we are going to just wait until it tries to process again. Once it does that, I expect the status to change to error hold, and then we can take a look at that. It is now in owned state and directly into error hold. So this is very helpful. This will no longer try to process. Your automation service operations are now freed up to move other batches that are working properly. If you have a lot of batches that are just looping over and over with errors, sometimes all of your batches that would have successfully processed just kind of get pushed back and not processed. It can really, really hold up things. So here we're at error hold, and you might wonder, okay, what do we do next? We can right click the batch and learn more about why it's an error hold by selecting batch errors. Here it tells us what we already know, but here's just an example of the error. If we didn't already look in our event viewer, this tells us the login failed for user PVC. So we know we need to go into SQL database, make sure and update that user password there, or change it within the job configuration. Once you change it within the job configuration or the SQL database, you would then go ahead and right click, change the status to not owned, and it would try to process again. If you did successfully fix the problem, it would go through successfully. However, if it comes across another problem or the same problem again, if it wasn't fixed, it'll just go back into error hold and then stay there until you decide what to do with it again. So we haven't changed anything. We just set it back to not owned, and you'll see it's back in error hold. So that is how error handling works with that. Like I said, you could set it up in all of your automated steps, and that is something, as long as you have PVC release 87 or 86 and higher, that is an option within your job configuration. All right, this is our last section. Thank you again so much for everyone's patience and all your questions that you've put in the chat. We're going to end off our training with talking about maintenance log cleanup. Definitely something super easy to set up, you know, pretty small item, but it can make a big impact in your environment. So you can set up maintenance log cleanup, which essentially cleans up all of your maintenance logs within Paper Revision Capture SQL database that are a certain age or older. Maintenance logs are created each time a maintenance queue item is processed in Capture. If you have, you know, hundreds and hundreds of batches running each day, those can build up extremely fast, and if you need to clear those out if they get a certain age, this is how you would do it. Just to start off, I will say that if you are using SQL Express versus the full version of SQL, you would know that your database only has a 10 gig limit. This is where we see it come into play most often. If that maintenance log table gets completely filled up, takes over the 10 gigabytes in space, you will no longer be able to log into the admin console. You would most likely get SQL errors, not being able to connect. Batches would come to a screeching halt, and just chaos everywhere. So this is definitely something that's more important than you might think, to keep those maintenance logs to keep them from filling up your entire space, especially if you're using SQL Express. You can set your maximum maintenance log age in system settings in the admin console. The default is set to 28 days, but you can make that more time, less time, whatever you want. It is set in minutes. I did have to get out my little calculator beforehand and make sure how many days that would be, but it is 28 days by default. I believe it's 40,000 some minutes, but that can be changed and altered to fit your environment. I know some companies need those cleaned out every week or even every few days to make it to where it's not taking over all of the space in the SQL database. So what it does, it just scans each time you have a maintenance log cleanup operation that's running. It looks for any logs that are older than that specified age and deletes them out of that SQL table. Another thing I wanted to point out is if your SQL maintenance log table is already full and you try to run the maintenance log cleanup operation, it will not be able to complete because the SQL table is already full and it cannot get in there and clean up anything. So if that is the case, definitely suggest making a SQL database backup. Never want to do anything with your SQL database without having a recent backup, of course. And then you can truncate that SQL maintenance log. And here's just a little screenshot of a way to do that. You can find that main logs table, script table as, choose the drop and create to, open it in a query editor and execute it. Very important to make sure you have the maintenance log one and not maintenance queue or the mail queue or anything else. Definitely important you don't delete a bunch of maintenance queue items if you have batches that are currently going through jobs. So that is really good information. If you're not already using maintenance log cleanup and you have SQL Express, I definitely suggest it. It also makes viewing maintenance logs in your admin console a lot easier. And I'm just going to go ahead and show you a couple things while we're here. In Global Administration Maintenance, you'll see that you have your maintenance queue. And this is where those submit batches kind of pile up. And once they're processed, they're removed from here. And then you have your maintenance logs. So this is being pulled from that table. Mine is very short and sweet because I've only processed a handful of batches in this environment. Otherwise, this would be extremely long and hard to sift through. So we're going to go into system settings, configure system settings. And here you'll notice this is that maximum maintenance log age. And it is in minutes, 40,320 is about 28 days. And that is where you can change that to fit your needs. All right. All right, that is the end of the technical training for today. Thank you so much again for your patience. I know we had to wait for a lot of things to load here and there. I hope that everyone could see the screen big enough to really see what was going on with those batches moving from one location to another. We are going to leave this open for a while longer, so feel free to use that chat box, ask any questions. If there was something that I didn't cover, we really only focused on our most commonly asked questions, things we see on a daily basis here in support. But obviously, if there are some errors that you are constantly coming up against, any situations that you just feel you would like troubleshooting help with in the future, feel free to ask those questions now or send emails into support@digitechsystems.com, and we will definitely get back to you and give you some tips, answer any questions you might have. And of course, if you come across anything out there in the field, call into support anytime, and we would be glad to hop on and take a look and help you out there. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. We are glad that you were here and hope you all have a great rest of your day.